April 1945. The war in Europe was ending, but the destruction had not stopped. Cities burned across the collapsing territory of Nazi Germany. Entire divisions were surrendering. Millions of soldiers were throwing down their weapons. And the armies of the Allies were pushing deeper into German land every hour. Among those leading the final assault was the commander of the Allied forces in Europe, Dwight D. Eisenhower. Eisenhower had seen the war from its earliest days. He had planned the invasion of North Africa, overseen the liberation of France, and commanded the massive Allied operation that stormed the beaches of Normandy. But nothing prepared him for what his soldiers began discovering inside Germany itself. When American troops liberated the concentration camps, places like Buchenwald concentration camp, they found evidence of unimaginable crimes. Starving prisoners, mass graves, piles of bodies, entire systems designed for death. When Eisenhower visited one of these camps personally, the experience changed him forever. He later ordered journalists, photographers, and even German civilians to witness the camps with their own eyes, because he feared the world might one day refuse to believe what had happened. The war was no longer just about territory. It was about justice. And soon, a moment would arrive that perfectly captured that new reality. A senior German officer, a general of the collapsing Nazi regime, requested a meeting. He wanted mercy. He wanted protection. He wanted leniency for himself and his men. For years, these officers had commanded armies across Europe. They had directed invasions, occupations, and brutal campaigns that left entire nations shattered. Now the tables had turned. The once powerful generals of Hitler's empire were suddenly desperate men, trying to negotiate their survival with the very enemy they had spent years trying to destroy. The general believed that Eisenhower might be willing to listen. After all, soldiers often respected soldiers. War had its traditions: surrender terms, honorable treatment, negotiations between commanders. But this was not a normal war. And Eisenhower was no longer interested in traditional military courtesy. Because by 1945, the scale of Nazi crimes had become undeniable. Entire cities had been destroyed. Millions of civilians murdered. An entire industrial system built around extermination. When the German general finally stood before Eisenhower and pleaded for mercy, he likely expected a negotiation. Instead, he received something very different. A cold answer. An answer that reflected not just military victory, but moral judgment. In that moment, Eisenhower made it clear that the era of excuses was over. The men who had helped carry out Hitler's war would not be able to talk their way out of responsibility. Some would face prison. Some would face trial. And some would face something far worse. Because the Allies had already begun preparing for what would become one of the most famous trials in history, the reckoning of the Nazi leadership at Nuremberg trials. But before those trials began, before the world heard the evidence, there were smaller moments, personal confrontations between victors and the defeated. Moments when the arrogance of the Nazi command structure collapsed into fear. Moments when powerful generals realized that the war they had helped create was now about to judge them. And one of those moments happened in a tense meeting between a desperate German general and the calm, unyielding commander of the Allied armies. In the next chapter of this story, we move closer to that encounter, and to the German officer who believed he could convince Eisenhower to show mercy. He was about to discover how wrong he was. Summer, 1945. While much of Europe was celebrating the end of the war, inside a military courtroom in Caserta, a very different moment was unfolding. A trial was about to begin that would send a message to the entire world. Sitting quietly in the courtroom was Anton Dassler. The once powerful German general looked very different now. His uniform had been stripped of its authority. The medals that once symbolized his loyalty to Nazi Germany meant nothing here. In this room, he was no longer a commander. He was the accused. Facing him were officers of the United States Army, acting as judges in a military tribunal. Their task was simple but historic: determine whether a German general could be held personally responsible for executing prisoners of war. The charge against Dassler was clear. He had ordered the execution of 15 captured American soldiers who had been part of Operation Ginny. Those men had been wearing U.S. uniforms when they were captured near La Spezia. According to international law, that made them legitimate prisoners of war. Executing them without trial was a war crime. And the Americans had the documents to prove it. During the trial, prosecutors presented the most damaging piece of evidence: a written order signed by Dassler himself approving the execution of the captured commandos. The courtroom fell silent as the document was read aloud. The signature was unmistakable. For the prosecutors, the case seemed straightforward. But Dassler's defense was ready with an argument that many former Nazi officers would soon attempt to use. He had only been following orders. According to Dassler, the execution had not been his personal decision. He explained that he had received instructions from higher command to carry out Adolf Hitler's infamous commando order. That order demanded that all Allied commandos captured behind German lines be executed immediately. Dassler insisted that refusing such an order would have been impossible. In Nazi Germany, disobedience to Hitler's commands could lead to court-martial or even execution. I was a soldier, he argued. I obeyed the orders given to me. For a moment, the courtroom considered the weight of that statement. War had created a brutal system where obedience was often valued above morality. But the American prosecutors were ready. They pointed out that other German officers had refused the commando order and had chosen not to execute prisoners. Some had even protected captured commandos despite the risks. This meant that Dassler had a choice. And he chose to carry out the execution. One witness after another testified about the captured Americans. They had not resisted after their capture. They had worn proper uniforms. They had clearly identified themselves as U.S. soldiers. Under the laws of war, they should have been treated as prisoners. Instead, they were taken to a remote location and shot by a firing squad. As the evidence piled up, the mood inside the courtroom grew heavier. Dassler's defense began to weaken. The argument of just following orders no longer sounded like a justification. It sounded like an admission. Still, the German general made one final appeal. He told the judges that the responsibility should lie with the Nazi leadership, not with officers like him who were trapped in a ruthless chain of command. But the tribunal had to answer a question that would shape the future of international justice. Could a soldier escape responsibility for a crime simply by claiming he was obeying orders? The judges knew their decision would echo far beyond this single courtroom. And soon, they would deliver a verdict that would send a powerful message to the world. As the trial continued in Caserta, the pressure on Anton Dassler grew heavier with each passing day. The American military tribunal was not only examining the execution of 15 U.S. soldiers. It was also testing a dangerous idea that many former Nazi officers hoped would save them from punishment. The idea was simple. We were only following orders. Dassler's defense team built their entire argument around this claim. They argued that in Nazi Germany, disobeying commands from higher authority, especially from Adolf Hitler, was almost impossible. The lawyers explained to the court that the infamous commando order demanded that all Allied commandos captured behind German lines be executed immediately. The order had been issued personally by Hitler during the war and sent down the chain of command to officers like Dassler. According to the defense, refusing this order could have meant severe punishment or even death. They argued that Dassler had been trapped in a military system where obedience was absolute. But the American prosecutors were prepared for this argument. They brought forward documents and testimonies showing that not every German officer had blindly followed Hitler's commando order. Some commanders had quietly ignored it, choosing instead to treat captured commandos as prisoners of war. This point was crucial. If other officers had managed to resist the order, then Dassler could not claim he had no choice. The courtroom listened carefully as prosecutors presented the timeline of events. In March 1944, 15 American soldiers from the Office of Strategic Services had landed near La Spezia. Their mission was part of Operation Ginny, a plan to destroy a railway tunnel that German forces were using to transport troops and supplies. However, the mission failed almost immediately. Italian soldiers loyal to Germany captured the Americans before they could carry out the sabotage. The captured commandos were wearing their official U.S. military uniforms. This detail became extremely important during the trial. Under the laws of war, soldiers captured in uniform were clearly protected as prisoners of war. Yet after their capture, the Americans were transported and held under German control. Eventually the decision reached General Dassler. Instead of treating them as prisoners, he approved their execution. Witnesses testified that the soldiers were taken to a remote location near the coast. They were lined up, guarded by German troops and shot by a firing squad. The prosecutors then presented a document that would become one of the most powerful pieces of evidence in the entire trial. It was a written confirmation from Dassler approving the execution. The document carried his signature. Inside the courtroom, the moment was devastating for the defense. Dassler tried to explain that the decision had been forced upon him. He claimed the order had come from higher command and that he had merely passed it along. But the tribunal asked a critical question. If the order was illegal under international law, did a soldier still have the duty to obey it? This question would soon become central to war crime trials across the world, including the famous Nuremberg trials. For the American judges, the issue was not complicated. They believed that certain crimes were so serious that no order could justify them. Executing prisoners of war was one of those crimes. As the trial moved closer to its end, the courtroom atmosphere became tense and heavy. Everyone present understood that the decision would set a powerful precedent. If the tribunal rejected the just following orders defense, many other Nazi officers could face the same fate. And deep down, Anton Dassler seemed to realize that his chances of escape were slipping away. By early October 1945, the trial of Anton Dassler was reaching its final stage. Inside the military courtroom in Caserta, the atmosphere had grown tense and heavy. 4 days, the tribunal had listened to testimony, examined documents, and debated the meaning of responsibility in wartime. Now the judges were ready to deliver their verdict. The courtroom fell silent as the American officers returned and took their seats. Dassler stood before them, his expression calm but tense. He had spent months arguing that he was simply a soldier obeying orders, that the real responsibility belonged to higher authorities inside Nazi Germany. But the tribunal had reached a different conclusion. The presiding officer began reading the decision. The judges stated that the captured American soldiers had clearly been wearing uniforms when they were taken prisoner near La Spezia during Operation Ginny. Under international law, they were protected as prisoners of war. The order to execute them was illegal. And even though the order had originated from Adolf Hitler through the Commando Order, the tribunal declared something that would soon become one of the most important legal principles of the modern world. Following orders does not excuse war crimes. Every officer, the tribunal stated, carries personal responsibility for unlawful acts. If an order is clearly illegal, a soldier has a duty to refuse it. This principle would later shape the historic Nuremberg trials, where many leaders of the Nazi regime were prosecuted. But in that moment, the ruling applied directly to the man standing before them. The tribunal announced its final decision. Anton Dassler was guilty of war crimes. The sentence was severe. Death by firing squad. For a brief moment, the courtroom remained silent. Dassler listened without speaking. The general who had once commanded divisions of soldiers, who had issued orders across battlefields and occupied territories, now faced the same fate he had ordered for 15 captured Americans. Over the following days, his legal team attempted to appeal the decision. They hoped the sentence might be reduced or delayed. But the American military command rejected the appeal. The verdict would stand. Early in the morning on December 1, 1945, Dassler was brought to a military training ground near Aversa. The sky was gray and the air was cold. A firing squad of American soldiers waited nearby. Dassler was tied to a wooden post. A cloth was placed over his eyes. In front of him stood the soldiers who would carry out the sentence. Moments later, the command was given. Shots rang out across the quiet field. Anton Dassler collapsed, his life ending in the same manner he had ordered for the captured American commandos. His execution marked a historic moment. He became one of the first German generals executed for war crimes after World War II. But the importance of the case went far beyond a single man. The trial sent a message that echoed across the world. Military rank would no longer protect those who committed atrocities. The idea that soldiers could avoid responsibility by claiming they were just following orders had been challenged and rejected. This principle would soon influence international law, shaping future tribunals and human rights standards. For many historians, the case of Anton Dassler became a symbol of a new era in justice. An era where the crimes of war would be investigated, judged, and punished, even when the accused were powerful commanders. And the story of the 15 American soldiers executed near La Spezia would not be forgotten. Their deaths helped establish a precedent that continues to influence how the world confronts war crimes today. The trial of Anton Dassler proved that even in the chaos of war, some rules must never be broken. And when they are, someone must answer for them.